6:44 p.m. Eastern, April 6th, 2026. 4 humans inside a cone-shaped capsule called Orion slipped behind the far side of the moon, and every radio channel connecting them to Earth went silent at once. Commander Reid Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. Mission Control in Houston could not call them, could not track them, could not help if anything went wrong. Inside that silence, the sun vanished from their windows entirely. What one of them did with a personal cell phone over the next several minutes became one of the most unexpected images of the entire mission. Stay with me, because that moment almost never happened at all. 10 days earlier, one hidden flaw in the heat shield almost kept this crew from ever leaving the ground in the first place. And what they recorded inside that eclipse is changing how a small group of planetary scientists are starting to think about the moon and about us. To understand why an accidental stretch of darkness became one of the defining moments of this mission, you have to understand what Artemis II was actually built to do, why this flight mattered, why hundreds of thousands of people had been working on it for the better part of 2 decades, and why every single switch flipped by these 4 astronauts was being tested for the very first time with a real human life on the line. Apollo 17 splashed down in December of 1972. For 54 years after that, every single human spaceflight in the world, every shuttle mission, every Soyuz flight, every trip to the International Space Station, every Dragon crew rotation, every Starliner test stayed in low Earth orbit, a few hundred kilometers up. Close enough that Earth still filled most of the window, close enough that a damaged spacecraft could, in theory, be reached, resupplied, or in the worst case, evacuated within hours by another crew. Close enough that Mission Control could see you clearly with a backyard telescope if they had to. For half a century, every human who flew into space flew close enough to home that, in the most extreme circumstance imaginable, they still had a fighting chance. Artemis II was built to break that streak, not to land. To fly around the moon and return, a 10-day shakedown cruise, the kind engineers call a free return trajectory. A loop designed so that if anything failed mid-flight, the spacecraft would swing around the moon and come home on its own, with no engines firing and no course corrections. You do not send 4 human beings past the moon on a brand new spacecraft's very first crewed flight and then simply hope everything works. You test it first, deliberately, on a path that brings them home even if everything else fails. This was NASA's very first crewed test of the Orion capsule, the very first crewed test of the Space Launch System rocket, the most powerful rocket the agency has ever flown. No humans had ridden either vehicle before, ever, on any flight, in any configuration. Every switch being flipped, every alarm being monitored, every system being depended on was being evaluated for the very first time with a real person inside the cabin. That is what makes test flights terrifying, and that is also what makes them necessary. Artemis II lifted off from Launch Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center on April 1st, 2026, at 6:35 p.m. Eastern Time. The SLS rocket generated roughly 8 million pounds of thrust at ignition, more raw power at liftoff than any operational rocket flying today. The ground shook for miles around the Cape. The sound wave bounced off the vehicle assembly building and came back at the press site as a second delayed roar. The crew was Commander Reid Wiseman, a veteran NASA astronaut who had previously commanded Expedition 41 aboard the International Space Station. Pilot Victor Glover, who became the first black astronaut ever assigned to a deep space mission. Mission specialist Christina Koch, who already held the record for the longest single spaceflight ever flown by a woman. And Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian Space Agency astronaut who was flying the first international crewed lunar mission in history. These 4 people represented the first time in over half a century that any human had ridden a brand new spacecraft past the shielding of low Earth orbit. The first new boots on a new rocket aimed at a destination Earth had not visited in over 4 decades. The last time humans had done anything of the kind, the Apollo program was still consuming roughly 4.5% of the entire United States federal budget. Inflation adjusted, that was north of $40 billion a year. Times have changed. So have the assumptions about how much space exploration should cost. And so have the buses. The mission was built to test every system a future landing crew would actually have to depend on. Communications, life support, navigation, heat shield performance, crew workload. The way 4 people share a tiny volume for 10 days without driving each other slowly insane. The way their bodies react to deep space radiation. The way the spacecraft handles a sudden emergency at the edge of cislunar space where no rescue is possible. Without all of those tests succeeding first, the missions that have been planned to follow had no chance of working at all. Artemis II was the dress rehearsal, but the curtain it was rehearsing for has not yet risen. The caution that put 4 people on a simple loops mission rather than going straight for a landing was not timidity. It was a lesson learned the hard way by every space agency on Earth. The shuttle program lost 2 crews. The Soyuz program lost 1. The Columbia accident in 2003 happened during a routine flight phase that engineers had been told was safe for years. The Challenger accident happened 73 seconds after launch, in front of millions of students watching on classroom televisions. Both disasters happened in low Earth orbit. Both happened close enough to home that emergency procedures existed. Both happened anyway. Beyond the moon, no emergency procedures exist. There's no rescue vehicle that can arrive within days. There's no resupply flight. There's no abort back to a friendly space station an hour away. Once Orion committed to its path around the far side of the moon, this crew was, for a period of hours, farther from any possible help than any human being in history had ever been. Building the confidence to accept that risk took the entire uncrewed Artemis IV test flight back in 2022. Plus years of delays, plus a small army of engineers being asked to certify, sign off on, and personally vouch for every single component on a vehicle that is going to be trusted with human lives beyond the reach of any help. As you are about to see, and that caution turned out to be justified. And it almost was not enough. 5 days into the flight, on April 6, 2026, Orion made its closest pass to the moon. The spacecraft performed a precisely timed lunar flyby, sweeping to within roughly 4,067 miles of the surface. The geometry of the trajectory placed the crew briefly inside the moon's shadow. Close enough, and at the right angle, to become the second crewed mission in history to see the moon's far side directly with human eyes. The first was Apollo 8, back in December of 1968. People call it the dark side of the moon. That name is misleading. It is not permanently dark at all. It gets just as much sunlight as the near side does over the course of a lunar day, which is about 29.5 Earth days. The far side spends half of every lunar month in full sunlight and half of every lunar month in full shadow, exactly the same way the near side does. What the far side never gets is a view of Earth, because the moon is tidally locked. Earth's tides have slowed the moon's rotation over billions of years until its rotation period exactly matches its orbit period. It always shows us the same face. The far side faces away. Robotic orbiters have mapped the far side in extraordinary detail for decades. Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been photographing it from 60 miles up since 2009. China's Chang'e program landed on it in 2019. India's Chandrayaan program has sent an impactor and an orbiter. The far side is the most heavily studied strip of real estate in the solar system that humans themselves have never set foot on. But almost no living human had ever actually looked at it directly with their own eyes. Not through an instrument, not through a relay, but with the naked eye from a window until this crew flew past it. Around 7 p.m. Eastern Time on April 6th, roughly 2 minutes after closest approach, the crew crossed a record that had stood since 1970. They surpassed the distance record set by Apollo 13. Apollo 13 had reached 248,655 miles from Earth during its own emergency return trajectory, when the crew had to swing around the moon using the lunar gravity as a slingshot to come home after their service module had been crippled by an oxygen tank explosion a few days earlier. Apollo 13 was, in many respects, a mission defined by limits. The farthest humans had gone for half a century was on a flight that was trying desperately to come home. Orion on Artemis II kept going past that limit. The spacecraft eventually reached 252,757 miles from Earth. A new record, more than 4,000 miles beyond anything any human had ever traveled before. NASA confirmed the new distance in real time as the mission clock ticked upward, and the world followed along through mission updates posted to NASA's website every few minutes. That moment alone, the moment in which the existing record fell, was supposed to be the headline of the flight. The whole reason so many people had worked so long on Artemis II was to put a new line in the record books next to the words, farthest from Earth. But then, purely as a function of orbital geometry, something else happened. Something nobody had scheduled. As Orion swung behind the moon's bulk passed directly between the spacecraft and the sun. From inside the cabin, the sun simply vanished. Completely. NASA's mission updates described the moment plainly. The capsule was passing behind the moon. The sun was entirely eclipsed from the astronauts' point of view. The crew was inside the lunar shadow. Rather than waste the opportunity, the crew pulled out eclipse glasses, the kind you and I might have used to watch the 2024 total solar eclipse from our own backyards, and watched. The eclipse lasted 53 minutes from the crew's vantage point. On the surface of Earth, the longest total solar eclipse physically possible is just over 7 minutes. The geometry is the limit. Earth's rotation makes the alignment drift apart before totality can run any longer. A solar eclipse on the ground is always racing against the spin of the planet. 53 minutes is nearly 7 times longer than the maximum eclipse anyone standing on solid ground will ever witness in their life. By any measure, the Apollo 8 corona observations were already short by comparison. By any measure, this held a record of its own, the first sustained natural eclipse observed by humans from beyond the orbit of another world. 4 people floating behind an airless rock, 250,000 miles from home, watched the sun disappear for the better part of an hour. got their timing proven right by the orbital mechanics NASA had spent a decade refining, watched the corona blossom into the dark, every detail of the sun's outer atmosphere, streaming in long streamers of plasma outward in every direction, was visible to the naked eye, stabilized by their spacecraft's slow, stately motion. That was the first time in history that humans had ever watched a solar eclipse from beyond the moon. Actually, from beyond the moon, not from orbit around the Earth. There was no analog. There was no rehearsal. There was no test footage. There was only the moment that the orbits had handed to them. And here is where this story becomes something stranger and more human than NASA ever planned. While the eclipse was playing out in the windows, one of the crew did something no flight plan or press kit ever imagined. At 6:41 p.m. Eastern, Commander Reid Wiseman pulled out his personal iPhone and pointed it at the window. Because Earth had just dipped below the lunar horizon. An Earthset, the mirror image of the famous Earthrise photograph from Apollo 8 that changed how humanity saw its own planet back in 1968. Earthrise was the image that, more than any single moment in the history of spaceflight, gave people a view of our planet as a fragile blue marble isolated against an abyss of black. It altered how an entire generation thought about Earth, about the environment, about who we are. Wiseman later described the moment in his own words. He said he could barely see the moon through the docking hatch window, but the iPhone fit perfectly. He shot the footage uncropped, uncut, at 8x zoom. He said it was roughly comparable to what the naked human eye would actually see from that vantage point. He compared it to watching a sunset at the beach, except from the most foreign seat in the entire cosmos. In the background of that same video, you can hear the mechanical clicking of Christina Koch's professional Nikon camera, its 400mm lens firing off 3 shot brackets. One astronaut working the checklist with professional equipment, another unable to help himself, catching the moment on the same kind of phone sitting in your pocket right now. That is the accidental capture at the heart of this story. Not a malfunction, not an anomaly in the data, but a human impulse to grapple with a moment too beautiful to lose, in a spacecraft that was never supposed to be anywhere near close enough for that impulse to be on the schedule in the first place. If you have ever been at the right place, at the right time, with something too strange and too beautiful to carry without recording it, you already know exactly what was happening in Reid Wiseman's hands. But during those same minutes of eclipse, the crew also did serious science. They photographed the solar corona, the faint outer atmosphere of the sun that is normally drowned out by the sun's own glare. From Earth, even the best coronagraph instruments rarely get 53 continuous minutes of clean viewing. The crew used that window for what it was worth. They also photographed the lunar far side in extraordinary detail, capturing ancient lava flows and impact basins essentially unseen by human eyes since Apollo 8. They watched for flashes that could indicate meteorite strikes, data that could help NASA understand hazards facing any future moon base. Every task that mission planners had hoped might fit into the timeline, all happening at once because the timing simply lined up for it. Everything the crew gathered during those hours, the eclipse observations, the corona imagery, the sweeping views of a lunar far side almost nobody alive had ever seen, exists because a chain of engineering decisions stretching back to an uncrewed test flight 3.5 years earlier worked well enough to put 4 living people in that exact spot on that exact day. And getting them home again afterward was the part nobody was taking for granted. If you have stayed with me this far, here's what I want you to notice. We have walked through the launch, the crew, the record, the eclipse, the phone video. We have not yet talked about the shadow hanging over the whole flight, the shadow of a heat shield that behaved wrong the last time it was tested, and that nobody understood well enough to trust without a fight. We are getting to it now. Here is where the story takes a sharp turn. Rewind to December 2022. Artemis I, the uncrewed test flight that came before this one, splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean after a 25-day loop around the moon. A full success by every headline written at the time. Most members of the public filed it away as Artemis working, as Artemis being ahead of schedule, as Artemis being ready to start its crewed phase. The agency was praised in Congress for once in a rare moment of bipartisan agreement for a program that was broadly seen to be back on track after years of cost overruns and schedule slips. But when engineers pulled the Artemis I capsule out of the water and inspected the heat shield up close, what they found was not what they had hoped to confirm. Patches of the Avcoat ablative material, the thick outer layer that absorbs and sheds the enormous heat of atmospheric reentry by literally burning away, had cracked. In places, chunks had come off entirely, what engineers called char loss, in a pattern that pre-flight testing had never produced. The exterior of the heat shield came back looking as pockmarked as the surface of the moon itself, with chunks of the protective material simply missing. That was not a minor cosmetic issue. The heat shield is the only thing between a returning crew and the kind of heat that turns aluminum into vapor. Orion hits the top of Earth's atmosphere at roughly 25,000 miles an hour, about 32 times the speed of sound. The heat of re-entry briefly raises the surface of the heat shield to temperatures around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, about as hot as the surface of the sun. For nearly 2 years, a NASA investigation team worked through the data. They tested spare heat shield material in ArcJet facilities, in vacuum chambers, and computer simulations. They convened independent review panels. They brought in materials scientists from other government agencies. What they eventually determined was almost elegant in its cruelty. Orion's re-entry trajectory involves what is called a skip profile, a dip into the upper atmosphere, a brief climb back out, then the final descent. The skip was supposed to spread the heat load out across 2 passes instead of 1. During that skip, the heating rate drops off temporarily, and that drop-off let gases building up inside the avcoat material stop venting outward the way they were supposed to during normal steady heating. Heat got trapped. Internal pressure built up. The avcoat cracked as a result and chunks fell off, exposing less protected layers underneath. The fix was not to redesign the heat shield. Engineering a new ablative material would have taken years and almost certainly pushed Artemis II past 2028 or 2029. The fix, instead, was to redesign the trajectory. Engineers ran new ArcJet ground tests on spare Artemis Y heat shield material. They verified the new path in independent review. They concluded that if Orion came home on a slightly different re-entry profile, with a longer continuous heating phase, and a sharper transition into the atmosphere, the heating pattern would stay steady long enough for those trapped gases to vent continuously, and the char loss would be substantially reduced. The shield on Artemis II was the same avcoat as before. The path was different. But not everyone inside the technical community believed that the underlying physics was actually understood well enough to bet 4 human lives on. Some independent reviewers and avcoat materials experts expressed concern that modifying the trajectory was a fix that carried unintended consequences nobody had modeled. The descent did not make most of the headlines. The descent did not stop the launch. NASA's leadership made the call. They flew Artemis II on the new trajectory, fully aware that this meant betting 4 lives on a path correction rather than on a hardware redesign. Think about what that means. This was not a disagreement about paint color or telemetry formatting. This was a genuine dispute between qualified engineers about whether the single most life-critical, zero redundancy component on the entire spacecraft, the component that absolutely had to work because there was no second heat shield under it, was fully understood. The heat shield question sat over the crew, and over every engineer at Mission Control, like a shadow, from the moment of liftoff all the way to the moment of re-entry. So, when Orion slipped behind the moon on April 6th and lost contact with Mission Control for roughly 40 minutes, that silence carried weight far beyond the usual tension of a communications blackout. Ground control in Houston could do nothing but wait, knowing the heat shield question still hung unresolved over the days ahead of this crew, knowing that until Orion actually came home through the atmosphere at 25,000 miles an hour, no one would know for certain whether the trajectory fix had worked the way the ArcJet tests had predicted. Beautiful images, beautiful risk, both inside the same 53 minutes. Now here is where we get to the part almost nobody is talking about. The data from the heat shield after splashdown and what that data actually does and does not prove. On April 10th, 2026, the answer to the heat shield question finally arrived. After a 10-day flight covering nearly 700,000 miles total, Orion re-entered the atmosphere at roughly 25,000 miles an hour. It endured a 6-minute communications blackout as superheated plasma enveloped the capsule and cut off radio contact. A tense, silent stretch every re-entry produces, regardless of what is happening beneath the heat shield. NASA's flight director later admitted to feeling what he called the irrational fear that is simply human nature during those minutes. He was watching 4 lives approach the atmosphere, the same way every flight director has since the earliest Mercury flights. 6 minutes of true silence. 6 minutes where everything works or nothing does. Then, right on schedule, the parachutes deployed. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego at 5:07 p.m. Pacific Time on April 10th. Recovery ships from the United States Navy and NASA's Exploration Ground Systems program were on the scene within minutes. The helicopters were airborne almost as soon as the capsule hit the water. Within an hour, the crew was on the deck of the rescue ship, in the same chairs that had carried Apollo crews home from their splashdowns decades earlier. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Engineers opened the hatch of the recovered Orion capsule and began examining the heat shield. Some avcoat char loss was still visible, but it was significantly reduced compared to Artemis I, consistent with what the ArcJet ground tests had predicted. The trajectory fix had worked mostly. Commander Wiseman himself, describing what he and Glover saw when they examined the shield afterward during post-flight inspection, said simply that it looked wonderful. A small amount of expected charring at the shoulder, the bell-shaped joint where the heat shield met the rest of the capsule structure, where heating is expected to be most uneven. Nothing that hinted at structural compromise. Nothing more than a thin, even, expected layer of darkening on the rest of the heat shield face. In the weeks after splashdown, NASA released its detailed post-flight heat shield assessment. The agency confirmed publicly that the avcoat char loss behavior seen on Artemis I had been substantially reduced, and that the performance matched the ArcJet testing closely enough to validate the trajectory-based fix. Beyond the heat shield specifically, NASA's broader inspection found the rest of Orion's systems held up well through the mission. Every switch, every valve, every life support component did what it was supposed to do for 10 straight days. The European Service Module, the part of the vehicle supplied by the European Space Agency that provides power and propulsion, performed flawlessly. The SLS ground infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center also held up well, with notably less wear on the launch pad and mobile launcher than after the previous launch cycle, meaning that processing for the next mission is unlikely to be delayed by anything discovered during the inspection of the flight hardware. But this is worth saying plainly. A future mission, returning from a higher energy lunar orbit or from the surface of the moon, will hit the atmosphere carrying more energy, under conditions the current trajectory fix has not yet been tested against. NASA's own engineers have been careful to frame Artemis II's results as validation of the trajectory approach for this specific mission, this specific energy, this specific flight profile, not as proof that the underlying material science of avcoat is now fully solved. Almost exactly is not the same as perfectly. And these two very different claims, the launch succeeded and we fully understand why, are being mixed up in some of the celebratory coverage. Only one of them has actually been established. The public mood in the weeks after splashdown settled into a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. Wiseman's iPhone Earthset video went viral within hours of being released. It trended on every platform. The solar corona time-lapse with the moon's limb perfectly framed in silhouette around the eclipsed sun was featured on every major news network. And Wiseman did his share of interviews, smiling easily, giving the credit to the team, talking about the eclipse in plain, straightforward terms. Glover talked about the honor of being the first pilot of an SLS rocket. Koch talked about the corona in technical detail, describing the streamers and polar plumes she had captured with the 400mm lens. Hansen talked about the international cooperation that made the whole flight possible. But underneath the celebration, an awkward question kept surfacing in technical forums and among the science press. The heat shield had worked well enough. Had engineers really understood why? You can imagine how uncomfortable that question makes a program office. A validation of the trajectory approach for this mission is not the same as fully understanding the underlying material science. Those are two very different bars. The first is what we needed to clear to safely fly this crew past the moon. The second is what we will need to clear before we send a crew down to the surface, where the return trajectory will carry significantly more energy, where the lunar dust will be sticking to the heat shield on ascent, where the re-entry profile will be different because the launch mass is different, where every margin of error shrinks. That work is happening right now. The spare Artemis I heat shield material is being subjected to additional ground tests. New ArcJet runs are being commissioned. Independent research groups at universities and at national laboratories are publishing papers analyzing the Artemis II char loss pattern, looking for signatures that might suggest the mechanism was properly mitigated, or might suggest it was merely reduced but not eliminated. Nothing about the heat shield is being treated as a closed case, but nothing about the heat shield is being treated as a catastrophe either. The honest answer is somewhere in the middle, which is the kind of answer that does not always make good headlines. Zoom out from the corona observations and the avcoat chemistry, and there is a pattern that shows up again and again whenever humans push past the edge of what is routine. The parts of this mission people will remember, the accidental 53-minute eclipse, the impulsive phone video of Earth setting behind an alien horizon, only happened because a much less glamorous, much more dangerous engineering problem got solved first, quietly, by people who will never trend on social media for it. Nobody films a highlight reel out of an ArcJet testing facility. Nobody ships a podcast episode about heat shield aerothermodynamic modeling. But without that unglamorous work, there is no 10-day mission, no far-side flyby, no moment for anyone to point a phone out a window at all. That, in miniature, is most of the history of exploration. The parts people remember are downstream of the parts nobody was watching. Think about what that means for everything still ahead. The next locked-in milestone belongs to Artemis III. That mission is currently targeted for 2027. Its stated goal is explicitly not to land on the moon. Instead, Artemis III will stay close to Earth in low orbit, deliberately practicing the dockings, the rendezvous, and the crew transfers that a future lunar lander will have to depend on. The lunar lander that SpaceX is developing, the one based on Starship, will need to dock with Orion in orbit around the moon, then ferry the crew down to the surface, then return them to Orion, then send the crew back to Earth. None of those steps have been rehearsed. Artemis III is the rehearsal. The mission that comes after that, Artemis IV, is the one with the historic assignment. It is currently targeted for as early as 2028. Its stated goal is to land a crew of 2 astronauts near the lunar South Pole, the first time human boots will touch the moon's surface since 1972, 56 years earlier.